The crystalline council chambers of Zephyria gleamed under the pale blue light of their twin suns. Kira 7 stood in the center of the judgment circle, her silver skin shimmering with nervous energy patterns that betrayed her fear despite her attempt at stoic composure. The 12 high arbiters loomed above her on their floating platforms, their ancient faces carved from living crystal, eyes like burning stars. Kira 7 of House Veltar. The Prime Arbiter's voice resonated through the chamber like breaking glass. You stand accused of the most heinous crime possible in our civilization: emotional contamination. The words echoed through the vast space, and Kira felt her bioluminescent markings dim with shame. Around her, the gathered witnesses, other young Zephyrians of her generation, maintained perfect emotional neutrality as they had been taught since birth. Perfect control, perfect logic, perfect emptiness. The evidence is undeniable, another arbiter continued, consulting the data crystal hovering before them. During the crisis on mining station Zerion 4, when 17 workers were trapped in a collapsed tunnel, you chose to risk the lives of the rescue team to save them all. This decision was made not from logical calculation, but from what you called compassion. The word was spoken like a curse. Kira's throat constricted. She had saved those 17 lives, yes. But in doing so, she had revealed the terrible secret she had hidden for 23 cycles. She could feel. She could care. She could love and fear and hope. Emotions that had been bred out of her people generations ago in their quest for perfect efficiency. Worse, the Prime Arbiter continued, when questioned about your actions, you showed no remorse. You stated, and I quote from the record, "I would rather die than let even one person perish when I could prevent it." Such dangerous thinking threatens the very foundation of our society. Kira raised her chin, her silver eyes meeting the burning gaze of her judges. I stand by those words. A collective intake of breath rippled through the chamber. Even showing defiance was proof of her emotional corruption. The Prime Arbiter's crystal features hardened. Then you leave us no choice. The sentence is exile to the forbidden world, the planet the primitives call Earth. You will be stripped of your technology, your identity, your very citizenship. You will live among the emotional savages until such time as you either perish from your weakness or learn to purge these feelings from your system. The primitive world? Kira's voice cracked despite herself. But the atmospheric composition, the gravity, will be your problem to solve, the Prime Arbiter cut her off. Perhaps struggling to survive among the most emotionally unstable species in the galaxy will cure you of your affliction, or perhaps you will simply die, which would solve the problem equally well. 3 solar cycles later, Kira found herself strapped into a basic survival pod, watching the swirling blue and white marble that was Earth grow larger beneath her. The pod was equipped with the bare minimum: a translation implant, basic environmental protection, and enough supplies for perhaps a week. After that, she would be on her own. The entry through Earth's atmosphere was violent and terrifying. Her people had designed the pod to be just reliable enough to get her to the surface alive, nothing more. She crashed in a remote forest area, the pod's systems failing one by one as she struggled to free herself from the wreckage. When she finally stumbled clear of the smoking debris, Kira took her first breath of Earth air and immediately fell to her knees, retching. The atmosphere was thick with organic scents, growing things, decaying things, living things. It was overwhelming after a lifetime of recycled, purified air. Her silver skin, evolved for the clean radiation of Zephyria's twin suns, began to burn under Earth's strange yellow star. The gravity, 30% heavier than her homeworld, made every step a struggle. Her bioluminescent markings, usually a soft blue-white, flickered erratically as her body tried to adapt to the alien environment. For 3 days, she wandered through the forest, growing weaker with each passing hour. The emergency rations from her pod were gone, and she had no idea what plants or creatures might be safe to consume. Her throat was parched. Earth's water sources seemed contaminated with minerals and organic matter that made her sick. On the 4th day, as she collapsed beside a small stream, certain she was going to die alone on this primitive world, she heard something that made her hearts skip with surprise. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that spoke of a bipedal creature moving with purpose through the underbrush. She tried to hide, but her weakened state made stealth impossible. A figure emerged from behind a cluster of trees, and Kira got her first look at a human being. He was tall by her standards, with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands that spoke of physical labor. His hair was the color of autumn leaves on her home world, and his eyes were the strangest shade of brown she had ever seen, warm, like rich earth after rain. He wore simple clothes of woven plant fiber and carried a pack that suggested he was some kind of traveler or explorer. The human, a male, she realized from the biological markers, stopped when he saw her. His eyes widened with surprise, then quickly narrowed with concern as he took in her obvious distress. She expected him to run, to call for others of his kind, perhaps to attack. Instead, he did something that shocked her to her core. He approached slowly, hands raised in what she somehow understood was a peaceful gesture, and spoke in a gentle voice. The translation implant processed his words. "Hey there, are you okay? You look like you need help." Help. The concept was so alien to her experience that for a moment she couldn't process it. On Zephyria, weakness was eliminated, not aided. The strong survived, the weak were allowed to fail. There was no concept of one person sacrificing their own resources or safety to aid another. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a harsh rasp. The human immediately reached for something in his pack, a container of clear liquid. "Water?" he said, moving closer despite her obviously alien appearance. "You're dehydrated." He knelt beside her, and she caught a scent that was completely unlike anything from her world, warm, alive, complex. Not unpleasant, just different. She reached for the container with trembling hands, but was too weak to hold it properly. Without hesitation, the human supported her head with one hand and helped her drink with the other. The water was strange, full of minerals and trace elements, but it soothed her burning throat. "What's your name?" he asked as she drank. "I'm David Chen. I'm a park ranger here. I manage this forest preserve." A park ranger. Someone whose job was to protect and maintain a natural area. The concept of preserving something that wasn't immediately useful was another alien idea to her. I was Kira 7, she managed to say. David's eyebrows rose. Was? That sounds like there's a story there. And you're definitely not from around here, are you? His eyes took in her silver skin, the fading bioluminescent patterns, the obviously non-human proportions of her body. Are you... this is going to sound crazy, but are you from another planet? Any rational being would have fled at this point, she thought, or called for their authorities, their military. Instead, this human was sitting in the dirt beside her, offering water and asking gentle questions. Was a criminal, she admitted. Banished here as punishment. David considered this for a moment. What did you do? Kill someone? Steal something? I saved 17 people who should have been left to die. The silence stretched between them as David processed this statement. Finally, he shook his head with what she would later learn was a very human expression of disbelief. Let me get this straight. You saved people's lives and your government punished you for it by dumping you on Earth to die? Zephyrians do not experience emotion as your species does, she explained weakly. To show compassion, to value individual life over logical efficiency, is considered a mental illness, a dangerous corruption that threatens social order. David stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his eyes that she couldn't quite identify. Anger, perhaps, but not directed at her. Something else, a kind of fierce protectiveness that made no logical sense. "Well," he said finally, "I don't know much about your people, but that's about the stupidest thing I've ever heard." Compassion isn't a disease. It's what makes life worth living. He stood up, slinging his pack over his shoulder, and extended a hand to help her up. "Come on, Kira. Let's get you somewhere safe and figure out how to keep you alive on this primitive world of ours." She stared at his outstretched hand, scarred from work, warm with life, offered without hesitation to someone he had just met and who was obviously not even his species. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help me? I am nothing to you. Worse, I am potentially dangerous, unknown. Logic dictates—" "Logic can kiss my ass," David said with a grin that transformed his entire face. "You're hurt, you're alone, and you need help. That's enough for me." As she took his hand and felt the strange warmth of human contact for the first time in her life, Kira began to understand that perhaps her banishment to this world was not the death sentence her people had intended. Perhaps it was something else entirely. David's cabin was a 2-hour hike through the forest, during which he adjusted his pace to her weakened state without complaint. He pointed out edible plants along the way, showed her which streams were safe to drink from, and explained the basic ecology of earth forests in simple terms. His enthusiasm for his work was obvious, and she found herself fascinated despite her exhaustion. "I've been managing this preserve for 8 years now," he told her as they walked. "It's not the most exciting job in the world, but I love it. There's something about being responsible for protecting a piece of the natural world, you know, making sure it's still here for future generations." The idea of working not for immediate benefit but for people not yet born was another concept that would have been incomprehensible to her people. Zephyrians planned exactly 17 cycles into the future, enough to ensure immediate stability but no more. Long-term thinking was considered inefficient. The cabin when they reached it was small but well-maintained, built from local wood and stone in harmony with the surrounding forest. Solar panels provided power, and a small garden grew vegetables and herbs behind the building. It was, she realized, a perfect example of humans living sustainably within their environment rather than dominating it. David settled her into a comfortable chair on the covered porch and went inside to prepare what he called real food. Apparently the water and emergency rations were just the beginning of his hospitality. She watched through the window as he moved around the kitchen, humming some kind of melody while he cooked. The smell that eventually emanated from the cabin was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Rich, complex, somehow both comforting and exciting at the same time. When he emerged with a bowl of what he called vegetable stew, she understood that human food was as far from Zephyrian nutrition paste as their emotions were from her people's sterile logic. "Careful, it's hot," he warned as he handed her the bowl and a strange utensil he called a spoon. "And I don't know what you can and can't eat, so start small." The first taste was a revelation. Not just the flavor, though that was incredible, but the care that had gone into its preparation. David had spent time and effort creating something pleasant, something nurturing, for no other reason than to help her feel better. "This is beautiful," she said, and immediately felt foolish for using such an emotional word. David smiled. "My grandmother's recipe. She always said food is love made edible." Love made edible. The phrase stuck in her mind as she continued eating. On Zephyria, food was fuel, nothing more, consumed efficiently and forgotten immediately. The idea that the act of preparing and sharing food could be an expression of care was revolutionary. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that her world's pale blue sunsets could never match. David built a small fire in the stone circle beside the cabin. The flames danced and crackled, creating patterns of light and shadow that were hypnotically beautiful. "So," he said as they sat beside the fire, "tell me about your world. What's it like?" For the next several hours, Kira found herself describing Zephyria in detail. The crystal cities, the perfectly ordered society, the complete absence of what humans would call emotional expression. David listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that revealed a quick intelligence behind his easy manner. "It sounds lonely," he said finally. Lonely? The word was not one her people had a direct translation for. Being around people but never really connecting with them, never sharing joy or sorrow or excitement or fear. Never having someone care about you just because you exist. She considered this. We are never alone. There are always others of our kind present. But do any of them care if you live or die? The question hung in the air between them. She thought of her fellow Zephyrians, her colleagues, even her birth family. Would any of them mourn her death? Would any of them celebrate her achievements? The answer was painfully clear. "No," she admitted quietly. David was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you saved those 17 people, and I'm sorry your people punished you for having a heart." Having a heart. Another human expression that would have been meaningless to her people, but somehow captured exactly what her crime had been. "David," she said carefully, "why do you trust me? I am alien, unknown, potentially dangerous. I could be deceiving you, planning to harm you." He turned to look at her, his brown eyes reflecting the firelight. "Could you? I mean, are you planning to hurt me?" "No, of course not. But—" "Then why worry about it?" He smiled that transformative smile again. "Look, Kira, I've spent my whole adult life working with nature, and there's one thing I've learned. You can usually tell the dangerous predators from the harmless creatures pretty quickly. You're not a predator. You're just someone who's been hurt and needs help." "But how can you know that?" "Call it intuition. Human emotional contamination at its finest." He grinned. "Besides, anyone whose greatest crime is saving lives is okay in my book." As the fire burned lower and the strange Earth night sounds began, insects chirping, owls hooting, small creatures rustling through the underbrush, Kira felt something she had never experienced before. Safety. Not the sterile security of Zephyrian society, where conformity protected you from judgment, but genuine safety. The knowledge that she was with someone who would protect her not because it was logical or profitable, but simply because it was right. "David," she said softly, "tomorrow when the sun rises, you could turn me over to your authorities. You could probably gain significant reward for capturing an alien being." "I could," he agreed. "But I won't." "Why?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally he spoke, his voice soft in the darkness. "Because 17 people went home to their families because you cared enough to risk everything for them. Because you were punished for being good and kind and compassionate. Because right now, you're hurt and alone and far from home. And the only right thing to do is help you. Even though it gains you nothing, even though it might bring you danger." "Especially then," he said firmly. "That's when it matters most." As she lay on the soft couch inside the cabin later that night, listening to David's quiet breathing from the bedroom, Kira stared up at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had happened. In less than a day, this human had challenged everything she thought she knew about the universe. On Zephyria, she had been taught that emotions were weakness, that caring was inefficient, that individual lives were less important than collective stability. But David's contaminated emotions had led him to offer aid to a stranger, to share his resources, to provide comfort and safety without any guarantee of return. More importantly, his emotional decision-making had been consistently beneficial, logical in a way her people's cold calculations could never be. By helping her, he had potentially gained access to advanced alien knowledge. By showing kindness, he had earned gratitude and loyalty. By trusting his intuition about her character, he had made a friend rather than an enemy. Perhaps, she thought as sleep finally claimed her people were wrong about more than just the value of compassion. Perhaps they were wrong about everything. 2 months passed like a dream Kira had never known she could have. David proved to be the most patient teacher imaginable, helping her understand not just how to survive on Earth, but how to live among humans. He taught her to identify edible plants, to read weather patterns, to understand the complex ecosystem of the forest preserve. But more than that, he taught her about human culture, human values, and the beautiful complexity of emotional existence. "You're a natural," he said one morning as she successfully started a fire using only forest materials. "Most people struggle with this for weeks." Kira smiled, an expression that had become natural to her over the past weeks, though it would have horrified any Zephyrian observer. "Perhaps my people's analytical abilities are useful for something besides cold logic." She had adapted to Earth far better than anyone could have expected. Her silver skin had gradually developed a tolerance for Earth's sun, taking on a subtle golden undertone that David said was quite beautiful. Her bioluminescent markings had begun responding to her emotions in ways they never had on Zephyria, creating soft patterns of light when she was happy or content. The greatest change, though, was internal. For the first time in her life, Kira was experiencing the full range of emotions that her people had tried to breed out of existence. Joy when David taught her something new, wonder at Earth's incredible biodiversity, sadness when they found injured animals they couldn't save, and something else, something warm and complex when she watched David work or listened to his stories or caught him looking at her with those kind brown eyes. "I've been thinking," David said as they sat on the cabin porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, "about what you told me about your people's technology. The medical advances, the environmental systems, the space travel capabilities." Kira tensed slightly. She had shared details about Zephyrian civilization during their long conversations, but always with the understanding that it was just storytelling, sharing experiences from a world he would never see. "What about it?" "Well, Earth has some serious environmental challenges. Climate change, pollution, habitat destruction, and we're just starting to explore space in any meaningful way. The knowledge you carry could help save millions of lives and preserve entire ecosystems." The weight of his words settled on her like a heavy blanket. She had been so focused on her personal exile that she had barely considered the broader implications of her presence on Earth. "David, I cannot. My people's technology is not meant for species that haven't developed emotional control. The power sources, the genetic modifications, the quantum manipulation systems, they could be incredibly dangerous in the wrong hands." "I'm not talking about weapons or power," he said quickly. "I mean the environmental restoration techniques you mentioned, the medical scanners that can detect diseases at the cellular level, the water purification systems that could clean entire rivers." She stared at him in amazement. "You want to use alien technology to help people?" "Of course. Isn't that what knowledge is for?" The simplicity of his answer, the automatic assumption that advanced capabilities should be used for the benefit of others, struck her speechless. On Zephyria, new technology was hoarded by the developers, used to gain advantage over competitors, controlled by the ruling councils. The idea of freely sharing life-saving innovations was revolutionary. I would need materials, she said slowly. Components that don't exist on Earth, and even then I could only build the most basic versions. What kind of materials? She described the crystalline matrices, the bioorganic processors, the rare elements that powered Zephyrian technology. David listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed his quick grasp of the concepts. Some of these sound like they might have Earth equivalents, he said thoughtfully. Maybe not exact matches, but similar properties. And there are materials here that your people might not have considered. Organic compounds, carbon-based structures, biological systems that might work in ways your civilization never explored. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of David's communication device, a primitive electromagnetic transmitter he called a radio. A voice crackled through the static, urgent and concerned. David, this is Park Service Control. We've got a situation developing. Some kind of atmospheric disturbance in your sector. Satellite imagery shows unusual energy readings, and there are reports of strange lights in the sky. Can you confirm? David and Kira exchanged glances. She felt her blood turn cold as understanding hit her. They've come for me, she whispered. Who? Your people? Before she could answer, the forest around them was suddenly illuminated by a brilliant blue-white light descending from the sky. Through the trees, they could see a sleek, crystalline ship settling into a clearing about a mile away. The design was unmistakably Zephyrian, all flowing curves and geometric precision, beautiful and terrible in its alien perfection. David grabbed his radio. Control, this is David. I can confirm unusual activity in Sector 7. I'm going to investigate and report back. Negative, David. Stay clear of the area. We're sending a full response team. He turned off the radio and looked at Kira with grim determination. How much trouble are we in? More than you can imagine, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. If they're here, it means the High Council has decided I'm either to be retrieved for punishment or eliminated as a contamination risk. Either way, anyone who has been exposed to me will be considered equally contaminated. David stood up. His jaw set in a way she had learned meant he was making a difficult decision. Then we need to move fast. Is there any way to negotiate with them? To explain that you've learned to control your emotions? David, no. The idea of him confronting her people filled her with terror. You don't understand. To them, what you call emotions are like a contagious disease. The fact that I've been living among humans, learning to feel even more deeply, will only confirm their worst fears about me. So, what do you suggest? That I just let them take you back to face punishment for the crime of being a good person? His protective anger on her behalf was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. It's not your fight. Like hell it isn't. David turned toward the cabin, moving with sudden purpose. You saved 17 people and got exiled for it. I'm not going to let them punish you for learning to be happy. He began gathering supplies, emergency equipment, communication devices, first aid materials. There's something your people don't know about humans, Kira. We're really, really bad at giving up on the people we care about. The simple statement hit her like a physical blow. Care about. He cared about her. This human who had every logical reason to turn her over to the authorities, to avoid the complications and dangers of harboring an alien refugee, cared about what happened to her. David, please. If they capture you, if they determine you've been contaminated by exposure to me, they won't hesitate to eliminate the threat. To them, you're not a person. You're a disease vector. He paused in his preparations and looked at her with an expression of fierce determination. Then they obviously don't know humans very well, because the more someone threatens the people I care about, the more stubborn I get. Before she could protest further, David's radio crackled to life again. This time the voice was different, cold, precise, speaking accented English with the mechanical cadence she knew all too well. Humans of the third planet. We are the Zephyrian Retrieval Council. We have come for the criminal exile Kira 7. Surrender her immediately, and no harm will come to your primitive settlement. Attempt to interfere, and you will be eliminated as contamination risks. David picked up the radio and, to Kira's horror, pressed the transmit button. This is Park Ranger David Chen. I don't know who you people think you are, but you're in violation of about a dozen international laws and FAA regulations. You need to vacate restricted airspace immediately. The silence that followed was deadly. Finally, the Zephyrian voice returned, now containing a note of what Kira recognized as dangerous surprise. You dare speak to the Zephyrian Council with such insolence? You are a primitive being of no consequence. Submit the criminal or face the consequences. David's response was swift and decidedly unprintable. Even through her terror, Kira felt a surge of admiration for his courage in the face of technologically superior beings who could vaporize him without effort. David, they mean it, she said urgently. Zephyrian ship weapons could level this entire forest. You have to get away from here. Not without you. He finished packing and slung the emergency kit over his shoulder. Come on. I know these woods better than any alien scanning equipment. We're going to ground until I can figure out a plan. A plan? David, they have technology centuries ahead of yours. What plan could possibly... I don't know yet, he admitted. But I'll think of something. Humans are good at improvising when we're backed into a corner. They left the cabin and melted into the forest, following trails that Kira had learned over the past 2 months. David moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years in these woods, leading her along paths that were barely visible even to her enhanced senses. Behind them, the Zephyrian ship's scanning beams swept through the forest, precise lines of energy that could detect life forms at the molecular level. But David seemed to know exactly how to avoid them, using natural terrain features and dense foliage to mask their movement. How do you know where the scanning beams will sweep? She asked, as they paused behind a rocky outcropping. I don't, he said with a grin that seemed completely inappropriate to their situation. I'm just thinking like a hunter. They're looking for heat signatures, electromagnetic patterns, movement. So we stick to cold areas, stay near natural electromagnetic sources like underground water and mineral deposits, and move when the local wildlife moves so our signatures get lost in the noise. It was brilliant in its simplicity, using Earth's natural properties and David's intimate knowledge of the local environment to confuse sophisticated alien technology. The fact that it was working was a testament to human adaptability and ingenuity. They took shelter in a small cave that David had discovered years earlier while tracking injured wildlife. The space was hidden behind a waterfall, naturally shielded from most scanning technologies, and stocked with emergency supplies that David had cached over the years. Okay, he said as they settled in for what might be a long wait. Tell me everything you can about your people's weaknesses. How they think, how they make decisions, what they're afraid of. Kira stared at him in amazement. You're actually planning to fight them? If I have to, but I'm hoping I can outsmart them instead. His brown eyes were steady and determined. Knowledge is power, right? So give me knowledge. For the next several hours, as Zephyrian search parties combed the forest and their ship's weapon systems charged with ominous energy buildups, Kira shared everything she knew about her people, their rigid hierarchies, their fear of emotional contamination, their complete inability to understand concepts like sacrifice or loyalty or love. So they've never encountered a species that would risk everything for one individual? David asked. Never. The concept is completely foreign to them. When they study other species, they look for resource conflicts, territorial disputes, dominance hierarchies. The idea that someone would endanger themselves for another person with no hope of gain is something their models can't account for. David was quiet for a long time, thinking. Outside, the search continued, Zephyrian technology methodically eliminating possible hiding places. But the cave remained undetected, the waterfall masking their thermal signatures and the mineral-rich rock blocking electromagnetic scans. "I have an idea," he said finally. "It's crazy, and it'll probably get us both killed, but it might work." "What kind of idea?" He outlined his plan, and with each word, Kira felt her amazement at human audacity grow stronger. What he was proposing was indeed insane, a direct confrontation with technologically superior beings, using nothing but psychology and the alien concept of human emotional loyalty as weapons. "David, this will not work. They will simply eliminate both of us as contamination risks." "Maybe. Or maybe they'll be so confused by behavior that doesn't fit their models that they'll make mistakes. Either way, I'm not hiding in a cave while they threaten to level a forest full of innocent people looking for you." Before she could argue further, his radio crackled again. This time, the voice was different, younger, less certain. "Attention, primitive humans. This is Sub-Commander Velnix of the Zephyrian Council. We have detected your Park Service response teams approaching our position. Withdraw them immediately, or we will be forced to defend ourselves." David grabbed the radio. "Sub-Commander Velnix, this is David Chen. I'm the local forest preserve manager. Maybe we can work something out here." "You are not authorized to negotiate with the Zephyrian Council, Primitive. Withdraw your forces and surrender the criminal Kira 7. "Here's the thing," David said, his voice taking on a conversational tone that Kira found both terrifying and inspiring. "Kira isn't a criminal by our standards. By human standards, someone who risks their life to save others is called a hero. And we don't surrender our heroes." The silence stretched so long that Kira wondered if the transmission had been cut. Finally, Velnix's voice returned, now containing a note of confusion. "Hero? Explain this concept." And David did. For the next hour, while search teams from both species converged on their general area, David Chen, park ranger and lover of forests, gave the Zephyrian sub-commander a lecture on human values that would change the course of interstellar relations forever. He talked about sacrifice and loyalty, about how humans measured worth not by efficiency but by character. He described the firefighters who ran into burning buildings to save strangers, the teachers who spent their own money to help students, the doctors who worked in war zones to heal anyone who needed help. "You see," David explained as if he were discussing the weather, "humans are pack animals. We're wired to take care of each other even when it's not logical, especially when it's not logical. The people we admire most are the ones who choose to do right instead of what's easy." "But this is inefficient," Velnix protested, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "Inefficient? Maybe. But it's also why we've survived and thrived on a planet that's constantly trying to kill us. Because when the chips are down, humans don't abandon each other. We fight for each other. And right now, that means I'm fighting for Kira." Kira listened with growing wonder as David continued his impromptu anthropology lesson, explaining concepts that her people considered mental illnesses as if they were the most natural things in the universe. Love, friendship, loyalty, sacrifice, emotions and behaviors that Zephyrian civilization had spent centuries eliminating, David presented as humanity's greatest strengths. "Your species' emotional contamination is a threat to civilized order," Velnix said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Our emotions are what make us civilized," David shot back. "Without compassion, justice is just revenge. Without love, family is just genetics. Without sacrifice, heroism is just showing off. Kira isn't contaminated, she's evolved." As dawn broke over the forest, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds that neither Zephyrian technology nor human instruments could truly capture, Kira realized that something unprecedented was happening. A park ranger from a primitive world was teaching advanced aliens about the value of feelings, using nothing but sincerity and stubborn human determination. And somehow, impossibly, it seemed to be working. Through the cave opening, they could see Zephyrian search craft hovering uncertainly above the forest canopy, their movements less precise than before. Human vehicles, park service trucks, emergency response teams, even what looked like military units, had formed a loose perimeter around the area, but nobody was shooting. "Sub-Commander," David said into the radio, "I'm going to make you an offer. Let me come to your ship. Let me show you what Kira has learned during her time here, how she's grown and changed. See for yourself whether emotion makes people weaker or stronger." "David, no," Kira whispered, grabbing his arm. "If you board their ship—" "I know the risks," he said quietly, covering her hand with his. "But I also know that the only way to defeat fear and misunderstanding is with courage and truth. Besides," he grinned that transformative smile, "I've got something your people have never seen before." "What's that?" "A human being who's decided to be stubborn about protecting someone he loves." The word hung in the air between them. Love. He had said it so simply, so naturally, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And looking into his warm brown eyes, Kira realized that it was obvious. Despite every logical reason to abandon her, despite the dangers and complications she had brought into his peaceful life, this extraordinary human being loved her. For the first time since her exile began, Kira smiled with genuine hope. Because if David was right about human stubbornness, and if love really was as powerful as he seemed to believe, then perhaps they had a chance after all. David Chen walked toward the Zephyrian ship with steady steps, though Kira could see the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed his nervousness. The crystalline vessel loomed before him like a frozen waterfall, all flowing curves and impossible angles that hurt to look at directly. Energy patterns danced across its surface, beautiful, alien, and undeniably dangerous. Kira followed at a distance, as they had agreed. David would make first contact alone, but she would be close enough to intervene if necessary. The human authorities had taken positions throughout the forest, creating a tense standoff that could explode into violence at any moment. "I must be out of my mind," David muttered into the radio he wore, knowing Kira could hear him, walking up to an alien spaceship to give them a lecture on feelings. "You're the sanest person I've ever met," Kira responded softly. "And the bravest." The ship's entrance manifested as David approached. The crystalline hull simply flowed apart to create an opening, revealing a corridor that pulsed with soft blue light. At the threshold stood 3 Zephyrians in full ceremonial armor, their crystal-embedded suits making them look like living statues. The center figure spoke with the voice Kira recognized as Sub-Commander Velnix. Human David Chen. "You are either very courageous or very foolish to come here." "Probably both," David admitted with a slight smile. "But I figure that's what makes us human." He stepped through the entrance, and Kira held her breath as the alien technology closed behind him. The ship's interior was a marvel of Zephyrian engineering. Walls that seemed to be grown rather than built, surfaces that responded to thought as much as touch, gravity fields that created multiple walking surfaces in the same space. But what struck David most forcefully was the atmosphere. Not the breathing mixture, which his body could handle for a short time, but the emotional atmosphere. It was like walking into a library that had never heard laughter, a hospital that had never seen tears of joy, a home that had never known love. "This place feels empty," he said aloud, and saw the Zephyrians exchange glances that might have been confusion. Sub-Commander Velnix led him deeper into the ship, past chambers filled with technology that David couldn't begin to understand, until they reached what was clearly the command center. Here, 5 more Zephyrians waited, their bearing and ornate armor marking them as high-ranking officials. Human David Chen, the central figure intoned, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. I am Prime Enforcer Zarathul. You have involved yourself in matters beyond your comprehension and endangered your primitive species in the process. David looked around the chamber, taking in the cold perfection of it all, then met the Prime Enforcer's burning crystal gaze with steady brown eyes. With respect, ma'am, I think you're the ones who don't understand what's really happening here. A ripple of shock went through the assembled Zephyrians. No one spoke to a Prime Enforcer with such casual directness. Explain, Zarathul commanded, her tone carrying dangerous undertones. Gladly. David moved to the center of the chamber, apparently unintimidated by being surrounded by beings who could end his life with a thought. You called Kira a criminal because she saved lives. You exiled her because she showed compassion. You came here to punish her for learning to be happy, and you can't understand why I'm willing to risk everything to protect her. Correct. Your behavior is irrational and inefficient. No, David said firmly. Our behavior is what makes us strong. See, you think emotions are a weakness, but you're looking at it backwards. Emotions aren't what make us weak. They're what make us powerful. He began to pace, his manner shifting into what Kira recognized as his teaching mode, the same tone he used when explaining forest ecology or conservation principles. Let me tell you about a ship called the Titanic, David continued. Big ship, supposedly unsinkable, hit an iceberg and went down. By your logic, the rational thing would have been for everyone to save themselves. Strongest swimmers first, most valuable individuals get priority. Forget about anyone who couldn't contribute to the survival effort. The Zephyrians listened intently, clearly puzzled by this apparently random historical tangent. But that's not what happened, David said. Instead, humans put women and children in the lifeboats first. The band played music to keep people calm while the ship was sinking. Men gave up their seats to strangers. People died protecting others they had never met and would never see again. Inefficient, Velnix observed. Many useful individuals perished unnecessarily. Did they? David challenged. Because those stories of sacrifice and heroism have inspired millions of people for over a century. They've led to better safety protocols, more humanitarian laws, countless acts of courage and kindness. The people who died protecting others on the Titanic have saved more lives through their example than they ever could have by living for themselves. Prime Enforcer Zarathul leaned forward, her crystal features showing the first hint of interest. You claim that irrational behavior produces rational results? I'm claiming that what you call irrational is actually a different kind of logic. A long-term, species-wide logic that you can't see because you've bred empathy out of yourselves. David turned to face each of the Zephyrians in turn. You want to know what Kira learned during her time on Earth? She learned that individual sacrifice can create collective strength. That caring about others makes you braver, not weaker. That love isn't a contamination, it's an enhancement. Through the ship's communication system, Kira heard every word, and her heart swelled with pride and terror in equal measure. David was doing exactly what he had promised, showing the Zephyrians what human emotional intelligence could accomplish. But she could also hear the growing tension in the voices responding to him, the way their perfect control was beginning to crack under the assault of concepts they had no framework for processing. Enough, Zarathul said sharply. Your philosophical arguments are interesting but irrelevant. Kira 7 has violated Zephyrian law and must face punishment. Your involvement changes nothing. Actually, it changes everything, David said with quiet confidence, because I'm making you an offer. The chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of alien technology. I'm offering to take Kira's place. The words hit the Zephyrians like a physical blow. Several of them actually stepped backward, their perfect composure shattered by the sheer impossibility of what they had just heard. "Explain," Zarathul demanded, her voice containing the first note of uncertainty Kira had ever heard from a Zephyrian authority figure. "Simple. You want to punish someone for showing compassion, for saving lives, for refusing to let people die when they could be saved. Well, I've done all of those things too. I'm just as contaminated as Kira is. More so, actually, because I was born this way." David spread his hands in a gesture of openness. "Take me instead. I'm a specimen of everything you think is wrong with emotional beings. Study me, experiment on me, do whatever you want. Just let Kira go." Through the ship's sensors, Kira felt her breath stop. This was not part of the plan they had discussed. This was David making the kind of selfless choice that his people were apparently famous for, and it was going to get him killed. "You would sacrifice yourself for the criminal?" Velnix asked, his voice filled with bewildered fascination. "She's not a criminal. She's a hero. And yes, I would die before I'd let you punish her for being good." The silence that followed was profound. Kira could see the Zephyrians struggling to process what they had just witnessed, a member of a supposedly primitive species offering to trade his life for someone else's freedom, with no hope of gain or survival. Finally, Prime Enforcer Zarathul spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" "Because I love her," David said simply. "Because she makes the universe better just by existing in it. Because a world without compassion is a world not worth living in." The admission hung in the air like a challenge to everything Zephyrian civilization stood for. Here was a human, demonstrating the very emotions they considered diseased, proving through his actions that those emotions could produce the most powerful motivation in the universe, the willingness to die for another person's well-being. "This is—" Zarathul began, then stopped, apparently unable to find words. "Impossible," another enforcer finished. "No rational being would make such a choice." "Then I guess humans aren't rational," David said with a smile. "And maybe that's our greatest strength." What happened next would be recorded in both human and Zephyrian history as the moment when two species truly met for the first time. Zarathul, Prime Enforcer of the Zephyrian Council, a being trained from birth to value logic above all else, experienced something her people had bred out of themselves centuries ago. She felt wonder. "Show me," she said suddenly. "Show you what?" "This love, this compassion. Show me how it works." David looked around the chamber, then toward the ship's hull where he knew Kira was waiting. "Kira, can you hear me?" "Yes." Her voice came through the communication system, tight with worry. "Come aboard. These people need to see what they've been missing." For a moment, Kira hesitated. Entering the ship would put her completely at the mercy of her own people, with no possibility of escape if things went wrong. But then, she heard the confidence in David's voice, the absolute certainty that somehow, impossibly, he had found a way to make this work. The ship's entrance opened for her, and she walked through corridors she recognized, but that now felt different somehow. The sterile perfection was still there, but underneath it, she sensed something new. Questions where there had been only certainty, curiosity where there had been only judgment. When she entered the command chamber, the Zephyrians stared at her with expressions she had never seen on her people's faces. Not the cold disapproval she had expected, but genuine fascination, as if she were some exotic creature they had never encountered before. "Kira 7, Zarathul said formally. "You have been exposed to human emotional contamination for 63 solar cycles. How has this affected your efficiency ratings?" It was such a perfectly Zephyrian question that Kira almost smiled. "I have become approximately 40% less efficient at routine tasks." "And yet," David interjected, "she's also become about 1,000% more effective at the things that actually matter." He moved to stand beside Kira, taking her hand in his without hesitation. The casual display of affection caused another ripple of shock through the assembled Zephyrians. "Watch," David said. Then he looked at Kira and smiled, that transformative expression that lit up his entire face. And Kira, infected by his joy, smiled back. Her bioluminescent markings began to glow with soft, warm patterns that turned her skin into living art. "She's beautiful when she's happy," David said simply. "More beautiful than any of your crystal cities or technological marvels. And that beauty comes from her capacity to feel, to care, to love." "But the inefficiency?" Velnix protested weakly. "Screw efficiency," David said bluntly. "You know what's efficient? A machine. You know what's alive? A being who can laugh and cry and hope and dream and love someone so much they'd give up everything to see them happy." He turned to address the entire chamber. "You've spent centuries trying to become perfect machines. But perfection without soul is just emptiness. You've gained control, but you've lost meaning. You've eliminated suffering, but you've also eliminated joy." "And what would you have us do?" Zarathul asked, her voice now carrying genuine curiosity rather than authority. "Abandon our civilization? Embrace chaos?" "Learn," David said. "Learn what Kira learned. That feelings aren't a weakness to be eliminated. They're a strength to be channeled. That compassion makes you braver, not weaker. That love is the most powerful force in the universe." He gestured toward the ship's hull, toward the forest beyond where human and Zephyrian forces still maintained their tense standoff. "Your people and mine could help each other. You have technology that could solve our environmental problems, cure diseases, open the stars to us. We have something you need just as badly. We know how to care about each other." For a long moment, the chamber was silent except for the soft humming of alien technology. Finally, Zarathul spoke, her voice carrying none of its former certainty. "What you suggest is unprecedented. To willingly expose ourselves to emotional contamination would violate every principle of our civilization." "Then maybe it's time for new principles," David said gently. "Maybe it's time for your people to remember what it feels like to be alive." Kira watched in amazement as she saw something she had never expected to witness: Zephyrians struggling with concepts that challenged their fundamental worldview. The perfect order of their society was cracking, not under external pressure but under the simple recognition that something was missing from their lives. "Prime Enforcer," one of the other officials said nervously. "We must consider the contamination risk. If word of this reaches the High Council, the High Council will learn of this when I choose to inform them," Zarathul said firmly. Then, in a voice that carried wonder and fear in equal measure, she added, "Perhaps it is time for them to learn as well." She turned to David and Kira, studying them with new eyes. Human David Chen. Former criminal Kira 7. I am prepared to make an unprecedented decision. But first, I must understand one thing. "What's that?" David asked. "If I were to release Kira from exile and allow her to choose her own path, what would she choose?" Kira felt David's hand tighten around hers, offering strength and support without words. She looked at this human who had risked everything for her, who had challenged an entire alien civilization with nothing but stubborn love and moral courage, and knew that her choice had been made long ago. "I choose Earth," she said clearly. "I choose humanity. I choose to live among people who believe that compassion is strength, that sacrifice has meaning, that love is worth any risk." She paused, then added with a smile that would have scandalized any Zephyrian authority just hours before. "I choose to be emotionally contaminated for the rest of my life." Prime Enforcer Zarathul stared at them for a long moment, then did something that would change the course of galactic history. She smiled. not the perfect, controlled expression that Zephyrians were taught for social necessity, but a genuine smile of joy and discovery. Then your exile is ended, Kira 7. Live freely among the humans, and may you find the happiness that our people have forgotten how to seek. 3 months later, David stood on the porch of his cabin, watching Kira tend the expanded garden they had planted together. Earth vegetables grew alongside hardy Zephyrian food plants, creating a living symbol of two worlds learning to coexist. In the clearing where the Zephyrian ship had first landed, a small research station was under construction, the first joint human-Zephyrian facility, where scientists from both species would work together to solve the challenges facing their worlds. The transformation hadn't been easy. Some humans remained suspicious of alien visitors, while some Zephyrians viewed the embrace of emotion as a dangerous heresy. But slowly, carefully, bridges were being built between two species who had more to learn from each other than either had imagined. "David!" Kira called from the garden, her voice carrying a happiness that still amazed him. "The crystalline corn is ready for harvest." He walked over to where she knelt among plants that glowed with soft inner light, their hybrid nature allowing them to thrive in earth soil while producing nutrients that could help feed millions. Her bioluminescent markings danced with contentment as she worked, patterns of light that spoke of joy, purpose, and love. "You know what the best part is?" he said as he knelt beside her. "What's that? Your people sent you here as punishment, but instead you found something they didn't even know existed. You found home." Kira looked up at him, her silver eyes bright with tears that her people would have considered a sign of weakness, but that David knew were expressions of the deepest strength. "I found more than home," she said softly. "I found proof that the universe has room for miracles." As the sun set over the forest preserve, painting the sky in colors that no Zephyrian technology could replicate, David Chen and Kira 7 worked side by side in their garden, tending hybrid plants that represented the marriage of logic and emotion, efficiency and beauty, survival and joy. Behind them, the research station's communication array hummed with messages traveling between Earth and Zephyria, carrying not just data but stories, jokes, songs, and dreams. The careful exchange of ideas between species who were finally learning that difference was not something to be feared, but something to be celebrated. In the end, Kira thought as she watched David's hands tenderly guide a delicate seedling into the soil, the Zephyrian High Council had been right about one thing. Exposure to human emotions was indeed contagious. They just hadn't realized it was a good thing.